So part of my case management resources I have, might as well do me doing homework actually. And this article, I'm just gonna read. It's gonna be quite long, but it says question: Is addiction a brain disease or a moral failing? Answer: neither. By Nick Heather. It was originally published in 2016. So. Abstract. This article uses Mark Lewis's work as a springboard to discuss the socio-political context of the brain disease model of addiction, the BDMA. The claim that promotion of the BDMA is the only way the general public can be persuaded to withhold blame and punishment from addicts is critically examined. Now that seems interesting to me, so I'm actually just going to make a note of that and highlight it because it's interesting. So hold on. After a discussion of public understandings of the disease concepts of addiction, it is pointed out that it is possible to develop a scientific account of addiction which is neither a disease nor a moral model, but when the public could understand. So evidence is reviewed to suggest that public acceptance of the disease concept is largely lip service, and that the claim the BDMA removes stigma among the public and professionals is unsupported by evidence. That actually seems interesting to me too. Furthermore, there is a good evidence that biogenetic explanation of mental behavioral disorders in general have been counterproductive in attempts to ally stigma. A model of addiction as a disorder of choice may attract special problems in public-facing communications and risk being misunderstood. However, ways of presenting this model to the public are suggested that may avoid such risks. Lastly, the claim that the BDMA is the only way of ensuring access to treatment and maintaining research funding for addiction is disputed, and a way in which these benefits can be retained under a disorder of choice model proposed. The article concludes by enthusiastically endorsing Lewis, called for a third stage of the governing image of addiction. So, that was just the abstract. Introduction. Mark Lewis is unusual, perhaps unique, in a neuroscientist's interest in addiction, who believes that it is not seen as a brain disease. He has been a great service to those who share his view, and that the brain disease model of addiction, the BDMA, is mistaken, but who lack the enterprise to criticize it under neurobiological grounds. But despite this debt of gratitude, I will not be concerned in this article with Lewis's analysis of where the BDMA goes theoretically wrong, and with the internal inadequacies of any other disease account. Rather, I want to use Lewis's work as a springboard to discuss the socio-political context of the BDMA and its possible alternatives, and specifically a spurious claim often made by the BDMA supporters. The claim is that the promotion of the BDMA is the only way in which members of the general public, and presumably policymakers, opinion formers, etc., can be persuaded to withhold blame and punishment from addicts for their troublesome behavior, and the only way to combat the stigma society attaches to them. But another way, the claim is that a rejection of the BDMA is equivalent to believing and promoting the idea that addiction signifies a moral failing on the part of addicts. This follows from the assumption that addiction is either a brain disease or a moral failing, with no understanding of addiction possible. No other understanding of addiction is possible. Many examples of this claim could be provided, but I will focus here on two from the early days of the attempted popularization of the BDMA, and from the latest defense of the model by its most prominent supporters, in which many be termed the BDMA Manifesto. So, the first one is as follows. One major barrier to closing the gap between scientists and public understanding is the tremendous stigma attached to being a drug user, or worse, an addict. The most beneficial public view of drug addicts is as victims of the societal situation. However, the more common view is that drug addicts are weak or bad people, unwilling to lead moral lives and to control their behaviors and gratifications. To the contrary, addiction is actually a chronic relapsing illness characterized by compulsion, drug seeking, and use. The gulf in implications between the bad person view and the chronic illness sufferer view is tremendous. As just one example, there are many people who believe that addicted individuals do not even deserve treatment. This stigma and the underlying moralistic tone is a significant overlay on all decisions that relate to drug use and drug users. The implications of this passage is that the only alternative to seeing addicts as weak or bad people, and thus the only way to avoiding stigmatizing them, is to view them as suffering a chronic relapsing brain illness. In a recent article aimed at defending the BDMA against critics, Nora Volkow, the current director of NIDA, together with the prominent supporters of the BDMA, insist that after centuries of effort to reduce addiction and its related costs, by punishing addictive behaviors failed to produce adequate results, recent basics and clinical research has provided clear evidence that addiction might be better considered and treated as an acquired disease of the brain. The implication here is that it is only the discovery that addiction is a brain disease that has put an end to the punishment of addiction. So they go on to say, the concept of addiction as a disease of the brain challenges deeply ingrained values about self-determination and personal responsibility that frame drug use as a voluntary hedonistic act. In this view, addicts result from the repetition of voluntary behaviors. How then can it be the result of a disease process? The concept of addiction as a brain disease has even more disconcerting implications for public attitudes and policies toward the addiction. This concept of addiction appears to some to excuse personal irresponsibility and criminal acts instead of punishing harmful and often illegal behaviors. The influence of the article by Volkow and colleagues, published in the prestigious medical journal, quickly followed its way onto blogosphere. The journalist Tori Utley, writing for Forbes, has convinced by the article that addiction should be viewed as an acquired disease of the brain based on the research that continues to give neurobiological evidence of addiction as a disease, not a moral failing. Dr. Michael Brent Zawinski, executive medical director of the Hoag Neuroscience Institute in California, went further in asserting that labeling addiction as a choice or habit instead of what it truly is, a chronic treatable brain disease, is intellectually dishonest. Enough has been said to establish that the promotion of the BDMA is typically accompanied by the writer that its only alternative is a moral view of addiction. So, what does the public understand by the disease of addiction? There's been too little research on this important question, but some answers to it can be advanced. It is clearly that the meaning of the term in the original language has changed significantly over the centuries, and the more recent usage has expanded from psychoactive substances to a wide range of substance-related and non-substance-related activities, to the point of arguably where addiction signifies little more than something a person spends a great deal of a time doing. In terms of attribution casualty, Robin Room has suggested that the addiction concept offers modern society a secular equivalent for possession as an explanation of how a good person can behave badly, and as an inner demon over which a hero can triumph. If so, it should be noted that, like a concept of demonic possession, this attempted explanation is circular. Why do people behave repeatedly in bad ways that are bad for them? Because of addiction. What is an addiction? Behaving repeatedly in a bad. So it just keeps going and going. So, whatever its explanatory function as a cultural concept, however, it seems true that in relation to substance use, if nothing else, addiction can serve the purpose in society that supporters of the BDMA claim for it, providing a way for members of the general public and others to accept. Superficially, at last, the addicts should not be punished for their troublesome behavior, but should instead receive compassion and care. Indeed, the disease concept has been promoted from about the end of World War II as a mark of liberal and enlightened opinion, in contrast to the old-fashioned and reactionary views that addicts are, in Leshner's words, weak or bad people. It is now known that addicts can't help behaving the way they do because they are compelled to behave that way by the disease of addiction. This exculpatory logic applies, of course, to any disease model of addiction, of which there are a great many, but seems to have been taken over by supporters of the BDMA, as though they were the first to think of it. Conversations with members of the public or journalist, politician, or nearly anyone who claims to believe that addiction is a disease reveals that is all they mean by it. Furthermore, inquiry soon results in a kind of circular reasoning noted above. Room may be right about the deeper cultural function of the disease concept, but in terms of practical consequences, all it seems to mean for those members of the public who subscribe to it is that addictive behavior is caused by some unusually unspecific kind of disease, and that as a result, addicts shouldn't be blamed or punished for behaving as they do. Let us assume, for the purpose of the remainder of this article, that Mark Lewis is correct and that the BDMA is fundamentally flawed in ascribing to addiction a disease status based on the neurological abnormality. Let us also assume to make progress in alleviating the harmful effects of addiction behavior. It is necessary to develop, test, and refine some of the other accounts of addiction. Lewis's own development learning model, or some other model that discards the fundamental premise of addiction as a disease. Would such an account inevitably sow confusion in the public mind? Would rejection of the disease concept lead it, as supporters of the BDMA perspective would very likely claim, to a reversion of moralistic attitudes and punitive responses to addiction? Thus, the question to be addressed in this article is whether it is true that there is no other way to persuade the public that addicts should receive sympathy, and when they ask for it, help to change their behavior. Related questions are whether the disease concepts in general, and a BDMA in particular, is successful in reducing stigma, and whether there is no other way of doing it. So, addiction and science in the public understanding. The idea that calling it a disease is the only understanding of the addiction that avoids blaming and punishing addicts is simply untrue. It is obviously possible to present a behavioral, a psychosocial, a biopsychosocial, or indeed any other plausible model of addiction without implying either that it is a disease or that addicts should be blamed or punished. For example, while Lewis generously concedes that the disease model has countered the perception that addicts are morally deficient or self-indulgent, arguably reduces the stress and isolation they and their families experience. There is absolutely nothing in his own developmental learning model that, despite its rejection of the disease model, leads us to conclude that we should return to seeing addicts as morally deficient or self-indulgent. It should go without saying that one can't derive an ought from an is, and that blame and punishment have no place in science. A modern alternative to a moralistic view of addiction is a scientific view, but disease models of addiction, including the BDMA, represent only one subset of possible scientific accounts. So, in claiming that it is only by seeing addiction as a brain disease that blame and punishment can be avoided, Leshner, Volkow, and their colleagues, in their remarks quoted above, confuse disease and science. It might be claimed, nevertheless, that the attribution of disease is the only way the general public can understand the proposition that addicts should not be held morally or accountably for their behavior. The only other words that addiction can be apprehended as being caused rather than freely chosen. Such a view would be deeply patronizing. When the first modern disease concept of alcoholism was formulated in 1940s and 50s, the only mature scientific language readily available for the public to approach an understanding of addiction came from medical science. Now, however, there is a much wider apprehension of concept derived from the neurological, behavioral, and social science that has been used for this purpose and can avoid the conflation of cause and disease with the continuation and expansion of higher education and growing participation at various levels of specialism on courses on aspects of neurology, psychology, and sociology. The public is much more au fait with concepts and principles that would allow them to follow non-disease explanations of addictions. Some kind of test of this assertion would be to follow up in response to articles and interviews in popular newspapers and magazines in which Mark Lewis has tried to explain his theory of addiction to the public. So, this video is already a little too long. I've read the first 4 pages, and there's still quite a bit to go, but you get the idea as far as what he's trying to do. The next section is about stigma. And then we have, if addiction is neither a brain disease nor a moral failing, then what is it? How could addiction as a disorder of choice be presented to the public? Addiction and access to treatment, and then future of addiction. So, I'm actually going to skip ahead to the section. I'm going to skip the stigma stuff and go to if it's neither a brain disease nor a moral failing, then what is it? So, the main purpose of this article has been shown that the BDMA does not necessarily lead to more benign attitudes to addiction among the general public and professional workers. However, the question in the heading above demands an answer before we proceed further, even if that answer is self-evident. As already noted, the model of addiction described by Mark Lewis in his article in his special issue is clearly scientific explanation of addiction that eschews disease and yet does not suggest blaming or punishing adults. There are unsurprisingly other possibilities. One is to see addiction primarily as a disorder of choice. There will not be space here to discuss this theoretic issue with any thoroughness, but a few observations may be made. Such a view of addiction might not be incompatible with Lewis's developmental learning model, but would place more emphasis than Lewis gives on reinterpreting the role of choice in addiction, while Lewis's model is concerned primarily with how addiction develops. A disorder of choice model is concerned to describe and explain the essential nature of addiction as a failure of self-regulation. Addiction is seen as a disorder of choice in the sense that it represents a kind of failure to make consistent choices over time. Thus, although addicts respond to incentives and are free to choose to use or not to use at any one time, autonomy is impaired when pattern choices is considered over time. A person makes a strong resolution at time to desist from a specific behavior. So, though addiction behaviors is voluntary at the time it is carried out, addiction involves an interaction of voluntary and involuntary processes, conceptualized in a dual systems account of human behavior, is kind of where that's going. So that's all I have to say about this article. Thanks for watching.